This episode is presented by Avalara.
Hello, this is Chip Zint, CFO of Deluxe, and you are listening to the CFO Thought Leader Podcast.
This is episode 895.
How many customers am I acquiring, and how are those customers performing? What we look at is how customers travel through their lifetime with us and how predictable that is. And actually, as you get more sophisticated with data, what we get to is actually, if I acquire a customer with this product and this brand, and they've got this credit criteria and characteristics, they are likely to follow this profile. And therefore that gives me a high degree of predictability. And by understanding it at that level of granularity, I can build up a picture overall of how the business is likely to travel in the near to medium term.
Hi, it's Jack. On today's show, we speak with Paul Sheriff, CFO of NewDay. Back in 2006, when Paul Sheriff had only recently been named Group Financial Director for a mid-size banking business, his team noticed the profit margins of a certain banking product were experiencing a steady decline. What's more, the new product's customers were deemed to be at higher risk than the bank's other customers. While Sheriff tells us that he helped put an end to the product's life, he also wants us to know that the numbers behind the problematic product appeared to be hidden in the bank's overall financial statements. You'll hear that story and much more on today's episode. We'll begin after this.
This episode is presented by Avalara. That's the sound of not worrying about sales tax compliance. Because when you automate it with Avalara, you don't have to worry about collecting sales tax or tracking who and what is tax exempt. With Avalara, you don't even have to worry about new tax laws and regulations. Avalara does it for you. If your business sells internationally, Avalara has you covered with cross-border tax compliance solutions. And when it comes time to file tax returns, Avalara automatically takes care of that too, giving you one less thing to worry about. Avalara has managed billions of sales for small, midsize, and enterprise businesses and seamlessly works with your current sales, e-commerce, and accounting platforms. Take the worry out of tax compliance with Avalara. Learn more at avalara.com. That's AVALARA.com.
Hello, we're speaking to Paul Sheriff, CFO of NewDay. Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.
So, Paul, we always begin by asking our guests to look back for us, try to identify some of those experiences they feel better prepared them for this role. What would come to mind for you?
Okay, so the three things I would have, let's start with, I think firstly it would be managing progressively bigger teams. And I go back to my first real experience coming out of practice, working for the Prudential, and that's the Prudential in the UK. I originally joined the Prudential and was managing a very small team of 3 people. And over the next few years, that progressively grew through team sizes up to, in the end, sort of 300. And I think one of the biggest lessons there for me was, what works for managing, let's say, sub 10 people is different to managing groups of, let's say, 30 people. Then again, different once you get above 100. And then again, when you get to 300. And it's how you develop and build those tools management styles as you progressively get those bigger teams that then stands you in good stead for future career opportunities. Because, today I manage a smaller team than I did, back in my early 30s, but nevertheless, I still use the same tools and techniques.
Can I just mention that's Prudential, of course, and you were within the finance function. What was your role?
So the role there was I started off actually looking after the commercial side of their change management program, and what it was really the early stages of what's now commonly referred to as business partnering. So really working on the commercial side with the business. And what happened at the Prudential was I kind of developed this model on my own, got it to work in one area, and they said, "Oh, that looks nice. What we'll do is we'll get you to look at that across progressive areas." So, firstly, it was then expanding it across the whole of operations, then across the whole of the operating business of the Prudential UK and Europe, and then for a period of time, I was interim CFO of the UK and European business.
Now, you refer to it as the Prudential. Is that it's not Prudential, it's the Prudential. It's the same company, of course.
I refer to it as the Prudential. I mean, if you go back in history, I think I'm right in saying that Prudential US and Prudential UK was back in the early 1900s one business. And I think there's a separation agreement that runs to a couple of pages, whereas today, I suspect in some demerger like that, it would be thousands of pages of legal documents.
All right. Interesting chapter. Did not know that. But thank you for that.
The second one to me would be, learning how to delegate, but also knowing that you've still got responsibility for what's going on. So it's a little bit linked to the first point that, when you're managing small teams, you can pretty much be across everything. If you're managing 6 people, it's anything that comes up through the chain, you can review, you can be on top of, you can look at, you've got the bandwidth to check and review that. When you get to sort of 20, it starts to stretch that. And certainly by the time you're getting to 30, you are going to, if you're reviewing everything, you are going to become the bottleneck in the business, because you are going to be sitting there with so much clogging up the inbox that actually people are waiting for you to do something or make a decision on. And therefore, it's about the appropriate point changing your behavior such that you're ultimately responsible, but you've got the appropriate checks and balances, processes and procedures that mean that can happen without your engagement and involvement, and you're delegating down, and you've got good people working for you who can take that on board, such that it's those things that need your attention, or those issues or hot topics where they're drawing you into. And it's adapting your style as you go through your career, because the more senior you get, the more and more you have to do of that, because you're either going to work 24/7 at that point, or you're going to be the bottleneck in the organization, or possibly both.
Help us understand better. I'm curious, this role that you had then, who are the professionals you're dealing with daily?
Oh, this applies across all my roles, actually. But I think the professionals, as you get more senior, you get people who are working for you who, they are coming up in their careers. It is appropriate to delegate more and more to them, but for them to almost come with your authority and have your sign off for things, rather than everything comes up through the hierarchy for review. It's a more general point, but it's carried through my career that, I will choose where to spend my time as to what's important, recognizing that I've got checks and balances in places that mean that I only have to be involved in those areas as and when it's necessary.
So what I'm thinking about is comparing you to other finance leaders who came up perhaps a more traditional track in accounting, and we're not getting all of this management of teams experience. How would you like to characterize it? I mean, it seems like at this chapter in your career, you could have gone any one of a number of directions.
I'll put it a different way. That, I've gone into a couple of CFO roles. I'm on my 4th CFO role now. And in a number of instances, you go into a CFO role, and, if you look at what a CEO is looking for, the CEO is looking for a business partner, someone who can help them on the commercial side. And they are interested in the financial historic performance and the results. But once they know them, they've moved on, and rightly so, they've moved on. But, as a finance professional doing the CFO role, you are responsible for all those aspects and all those things that, you are looked to just, that is happening. That's on your watch. You're responsible for it. What I found going into roles is I've seen that there's, over time, you have to spend time on those, what I'd say is the more financial control side of the world, the financial accounting, financial reporting, etc., in the early stages of a role, as you make sure it's working properly, find the gaps, recruit the appropriate people, delegate down, such that you can over time spend more time on the value add. And I've not been fortunate enough to go into a role where everything's working perfectly. You know, I'm waiting for that day.
So the track you ultimately land on, and I think even the one today, more entrepreneurial, how would you characterize it? You did emphasize how today it's smaller.
I mean, I actually made a conscious decision at my Prudential days that, you know, the Prudential is a UK FTSE 100 listed business. And I took the decision when, you know, I was in a division to essentially branch out on my own as CFO. But at that point, I recognized I need to just go to a smaller business. A little bit of leap into the unknown. You know, I've worked in bigger businesses, but you always recognize that smaller businesses could be a bit more fun. And, you know, I took that leap into a small bank. And ever since then, I've been in what I'd say medium-sized businesses that have got enough about them and enough momentum. But nevertheless, the one I'm in at the moment is, you know, is probably roughly 3 times the size of when I joined 7 years ago. And that growth, that entrepreneurial side, that's what I've built my career on, and has been really exciting. You know, supporting the business through that growth is amazing.
I wonder, just given the fact that your career was largely commercial facing from its earliest days, whether you have a different perspective or a different set of priorities when it comes to the finance function, what it does well, what it doesn't or shouldn't do. What would you tell us?
I don't know if I look at it particularly differently to many others, but I mean the way I've always thought about building finance teams is you've got to get the right structures and processes in place to get what I'd say is the reporting side and the day-to-day management in place. And my big learning there is I've always looked to invest in tools and techniques that take out the day-to-day repetitive work and use that to essentially invest in the more, what I'd say is the value add business supporting areas. So although the head count in my area hasn't grown nowhere near in proportion to the growth of the business, but we've got more and more efficient on the financial management, the financial reporting, the financial operations side, such that we can invest in more into the business partnering side. So my take is I've got to get all the activities of finance working, but I really want to invest in the business support, because I think that's where you get the value add for the business. And, you know, it gives me the greatest pleasure when I see, you know, the business heads in our business working alongside their financial professionals, and bouncing off each other with ideas and helping the business collectively move forward.
I'm wondering, when you had this huge transition, when you go to Record PLC and you're the COO and Chief Operating Officer, that's something of a significant change. Or maybe not. Maybe you're like, not really, Jack. But it seems to me like you made a certain career decision at that place in time. Am I overemphasizing that? Or
I think I'd say throughout my career, I've always looked at, you know, what skill set have you got and how can you apply it? And always looking for, you know, what's the next thing? How do you personally move forward? How do you keep yourself challenged and engaged? I think, you know, the Record story is one where actually I joined that business as the CFO, and it was just a matter of, you know, having mastered the CFO role, if you want to call it that. The business decided, because of other changes, that actually the chief operating officer was leaving. Why doesn't Paul just pick up the responsibilities that used to sit under the chief operating officer? And, you know, it's about, to me, that was about building a competent team in the finance function such that I had bandwidth to do other things. Now, it was then a discussion about what I spent my time doing. But they've, you know, again, with some good operations people, I had the bandwidth to look after that operation there. I mean, Record is, for me, is a great story, because ultimately for a Record, I was able to leave the business, and two people underneath me stepped up. They split the role again between the CFO and the COO role. And they did, the best legacy you can leave is actually you've got people underneath you for succession. And the fact that you leave the business means the business travels on without you, but you've left your mark and you've moved on to pastures new.
Do you think you were always well suited for operations versus, say, being a controller?
Oh, my career, as hopefully it's coming across, has been much more on the commercial side. If you look throughout my career, I've always made sure I've recruited a good financial controller in each of the businesses I've been along. I don't think I would be the best person to day run that aspect of finance. I'm much more into what's happening in the future and helping out. I recognize my role is to make sure the books, the records, and everything happens from a finance side. But I do heavily rely on a financial controller and have done throughout the 4 CFO roles I've had.
And so that's a great insight for us. Again, you're sort of this outward-facing commercial world executive, and along the way, you learned how to match your skill set with a strong controllership function and some good hires. Any advice as to how to identify a strong controller candidate, or the qualities that you've discovered along the way that allow you to lock down that function?
I think financial controllers need to have the relevant expertise and experience. They certainly need to have an attention to detail, and they also need to be willing. There's quite repetitive processes in there, be it monthly processes, be it quarterly processes, be it annual processes, and year to year, a lot of those processes are very similar. And actually, if you look at any of the psychometric profiles, you all, certainly for myself, it almost complements me to have someone almost diametrically opposed on whichever of those Myers-Briggs or whatever you want to say, because it actually brings complementary skills to your own. We've all got our blind spots. It's recognizing those and understanding how do you compensate for them and recruit people. I mean, the financial controls I've had have all been very level-headed, able to deal with issues, not dramatic about what's going on, and therefore we've worked together to work through that, and very successfully.
The other, again, one last question that I think would be revealing for you in some ways as well, is that during the course of finance leaders' path upward, there's always sort of a moment where they have an opportunity to present to the board or senior management. And my guess would be that moment happened rather early in your career. I don't know that, but as a commercial outward-facing executive, one would think that you might operate well in that situation. Don't know, but is there anything come to mind about a moment where you had to step into senior management and just whether it was discussing a problem or presenting some numbers, anything?
Yeah, I mean, it was going to be my third point, was actually about managing upwards. I mean, I think that's a key facet. I mean, I think you need to spend time managing upwards and making sure you're addressing what your boss or the board need to know. I mean, my experience at talking up to that level was actually, again, going back to the Prudential. I went in, as I said, to look after the change management world. You'll appreciate that any investment spend is subject to prioritizations across the business, making sure executives are aligned, and executives in different functional areas always like their own projects more than the other department's projects. So there's always a negotiation, a balancing act about how you choose to invest in the business. My experience at the Prudential was very much thrown into the deep end of, Paul, tell us the answer of how we prioritize all this. Come and present and answer all the questions. And I think my lesson learned was the first time I went in and said, here's the facts, expecting them to tell me the answer. And I quickly realized that I wasn't going to get the answer back in those meetings. And I turned it on its head to say, well, here's my suggestion. Tell me why it's not the right one. And here's some of the analysis that supports that prioritization. And ever since then, my approach has been always, here's my recommendation, here's why I got there, and here's some of the facts that support it. I think I see too many presentations. It's not a NewDay phenomenon. It's across industries, businesses, which junior people tend to say, "Look at all this fantastic analysis I've done. You go figure the answer." And I think when you turn it on its head, it's when you're starting to think in a leadership context of how you're moving into that space of giving recommendations and helping the business move forward.
Well, Paul, we may have a few more career-related questions for you a little later in the podcast, but right now, let's find out about NewDay. Tell us about this company. What does it do, and what are its offerings today?
Okay, so NewDay is a UK business. We are a consumer credit company. So we provide products to circa 5 million customers with access to credit. So the broad credit offering spans credit cards, installment finance, 0% finance, buy now, pay later, digital revolving credit. We take that to market through a number of what I would say direct to consumer products and brands, and a range of credit programs with, well, certainly in the UK, some of the most loved brands in the UK. So last year we started taking on the John Lewis program, which for those listeners in the UK will definitely recognise John Lewis, on one of the large electrical retailers, AO.com. And historically, although we don't do it currently, in the not too distant past, we've done Amazon's credit card in the UK. The business underpinned very much digital first business. So, our customer interactions are all, well, predominantly mobile based. And, that's underpinned by, an awful lot of digital investment, digital development, and an innovative culture. And as I said, over the sort of 7 years I've been at the business, it's pretty much tripled in size in any of the measures you could care to mention. So, in summary, we're an inclusive lender in the UK, and we strive to help customers responsibly make the most of the credit offerings we give to them.
Now, can you give us maybe an abbreviated history of this company's capital structure? It's private today?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now founded probably now getting on for nearly 20 years ago, has been through a slower start in its history, I'd say, in the first 10 years. It then got backing, pre my time, from private equity, but it was at the smaller end of the private equity scale. I joined the business in 2016. We were then owned by private equity, a company called Vade Partners. And then in 2017, or sort of a year after I joined, we sold the business. We're now owned by a consortium of private equity owners, Simban and CVC. So that's the equity side of the business. On the debt side of the business, we've got a high yield bond that's listed on the relevant market. And also, because we lend to consumers, we've got a huge amount of asset-backed funding, and we work with all the major international banks you could care to mention.
Can you what is the head count of the company currently?
About 1,300.
And how did you fare head count? Was there much churn during COVID?
So COVID for us was head count wise remained relatively static. We were probably about 1,200-ish through COVID. I think we'd made the transition to a large proportion of our systems, etc., being cloud-based. So actually the move to being off-premises and having workers work remote wasn't as significant as for many others. The majority, we already had a very flexible structure that, the majority of employees were all laptop-based in any case. So, I remember that day we we decided to do a trial from home and never came back because in the course of that day, the situation had got worse that, we didn't come back and we were then remote for the period of time through COVID.
Let's ask you about your lines of sight into the business and how it's performing. Are there certain numbers that would you be looking at daily? What are the numbers that grab your attention each morning?
Yeah, so business dynamics for us are things that I always think of it from finance perspective as when I see it in the actual finance numbers, something has happened weeks, months before that to drive that number to where it is. So I've always, in all the roles I've done, looked at what are the forward measures or the things I can see today in the business that help me understand where I'm likely to go into the future. So in NewDay, the ones we look at are, particularly in terms of what the output is, what is customer spend and payments doing, and what's that doing to the overall receivables we've got outstanding to customers. But the real insight we get is from looking at how are two things faring. How many customers am I acquiring, and how are those customers performing? And the way we think about it is, what we look at is how customers travel through their lifetime with us and how predictable that is. And actually, as you get more sophisticated with data, what we get to is actually, if I acquire a customer with this product and this brand, and they've got this credit criteria and characteristics, they are likely to follow this profile. And therefore, that gives me a high degree of predictability. And by understanding it at that level of granularity, I can build up a picture overall of how the business is likely to travel in the near to medium term.
So just as you mentioned, predictability during your tenure, how has that predictability escalated? How has it, if we were to turn back the clock, and what type of predictability did you have back in 2016 or when you first joined the firm?
I think we still had the data back then and we still understood it, but we didn't have the modern tools and techniques that enable you to turn it around very quickly. So I think if you go back then, it was predominantly Excel based. And as you'll appreciate, any number of Excel spreadsheets or work tabs or, and building those up and trying to consolidate them is a huge, huge task. I think where we've moved to is cloud-based solutions that enable, first of all, multiple people to work on things concurrently, together with the ability to do them at just much quicker pace. So, we've probably gone from consolidating, a financial budget that would have taken 3-4 days to you can do it within an hour. And therefore, it's that journey and that ability to turn things around much quicker that is the real change I've seen in the last 4 to 5 years. I think people have always had models and different degrees of sophistication. It's the speed you can deploy those models and the sophistication you can bring to bear.
If we were to ask you about non-financial metrics, would the Net Promoter Score be perhaps your top non-financial metric, or how would you?
Net Promoter Score would be from a customer perspective, yeah. That would be certainly one of them, together with things like complaints volumes. We're very conscious of that, being a financial service regulated business. I think other metrics. We're obviously looking at how the macro's faring. And we've done work with consultancies looking at what are those leading indicators on the macro that we should be taking into account looking at our business. So to give you an example, it's not at this point, but historically we've looked at things like the prevalence of people to search in the UK for redundancy would be an indicator of stress in the employment market, and that tends to come before you see other metrics moving.
We've been asking finance leaders lately, since the start of the year. Certainly ChatGPT has caught a lot of people's attention, and a lot of strategy discussions have begun to sort of focus on it. What about this organization? Have you And I don't know, maybe you have a past, had been investing in AI in different areas, but just curious how the strategy discussions that you participate in, whether ChatGPT is something that's been explored, talked about, emphasized.
It's clearly a topic of general conversation, isn't it? But we haven't looked at Chat GPT in particular in its own. What we have been doing is we've been on a progressive journey of this automation. So for a number of years, and these are getting forever more sophisticated. We had something called what we called robotic process automation, which is commonly called RPA, which essentially, when you're looking at older systems, enabled repetitive tasks to be automated, i.e. the bot woke up in the morning, it logged on to all the systems, it took data from system A, it took that data, put it into system B or whatever it did. And we had a number of those running in the business, which reduced repetitive tasks. I think where we're moving towards and where we've done a lot of work, and I'm certainly not the expert on it, is in terms of chat functionality with customers. So, if you go onto the website and instigate a chat function, how much of that is automated versus there's actually a person at the other end, and it's that and those systems are doing handoffs to people, etc. And those systems are getting forever more sophisticated. And we are certainly encouraging customers, and we are seeing it. Certainly with the more and more customers want to engage forever in a digital context, which is great from their perspective. It's great from our perspective, and that sophistication continues.
So again, just understanding that you're looking to really understand better customer behaviors digitally. I'm wondering if your team, and I'm thinking of your FP&A people, your data insight people, whether you have sought to team them up differently, whether you have had to dedicate different professionals to achieve all of what you'd like to achieve in terms of reading customer behaviors more effectively. Is there anything you've done to structure your finance team or encourage them to collaborate at a new and different threshold?
I think a lot of the customer side is clearly dealt with in our digital engineering teams. It sits outside of finance. But in terms of finance, I think those skill sets that are different are those people who can program engineer these cloud-based solutions, deal with big data sets. That's forever becoming an increasingly important skill. So and it doesn't mean you've followed a traditional finance route to get to that point. I think in most areas of our business, we've got people who are now manipulating pretty big data sets to get insight and meaning from them. And it helps if you've got the finance background, but you don't per se need to have had it.
Right. What I'm always trying to understand better, though, is that, who's around the table? Is finance being invited into meetings that perhaps it hadn't been before, vice versa? Are you inviting your digital engineers to come together and understand better which measurements would be more strategic for the organization overall if you could only understand them better? That type of discussion.
Yeah, I mean, we've got data science teams that don't reside within my finance world, but I mean, the cutting edge of that is in our world always from a customer underwriting perspective. What is it that leads us to identify this is a customer we should be extending credit to, and this is a customer we shouldn't be extending credit to? And that is about trying to understand and get predictive models as to how underwriting can be. That is at the leading edge of how we're trying to use insightful data.
Yeah. And is that's an ongoing discussion, happens in fits and starts? There wasn't some sort of special SWAT team that you formed to get to the bottom of it or take it to the next level?
Well, I mean, we're constantly looking for the next iteration and the next insightful bit of data to put it into. We're on our 11th generation of underwriting models. So you can see that that's an evolution, and that's it. That's an 11th major release. Should I put it that way? I mean, every month we are making subtle changes to see if at the edges we can get better predictors of risk.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. We are up to what we refer to as our finance strategic moment question, and this is where we ask you to think back in time. Might have happened 6 months ago, might have been 10 years ago. But you had a moment of strategic insight. You saw something, you identified a risk. Perhaps it was an opportunity that was pursued. I don't know. But your lines of sight into the organization as a finance executive allowed you to detect something and you responded to it. Anything come to mind when we ask for a finance strategic moment?
Yeah, in terms of the story I'd like to share, it goes back to 2006, so just before the financial crisis. This is how data drove a really insightful decision that made a really meaningful difference to the business. And I was at that point I was CFO of a small UK banking business. So to put it into context, at that time, one of the businesses we had was doing a lending product in the unsecured space, and the dynamics of it were such that what we were seeing was slightly steadily declining margins at a time when we were taking slightly more riskier customers on board. And if you looked at it in the short term, it wasn't that noticeable. But if you looked at it over a longer period, what you could see that was happening. But then when you looked at the finance numbers overall, because you were looking at a book of business that had been built over a period of time, everything looked fine, because the size of the back book of customers was dwarfing the new customers, such that it all looked okay. It was by unpicking and just solely looking at the new customers did you see this data set emerge that was showing that, over time, with competitive pressures and the fact that we were taking more risk, this was heading towards a situation that wasn't sustainable for the business. And as we deep dived into it, we realized that even the pace it was getting worse was accelerating. And as a result of that, we took the decision towards the end of 2006 to actually stop writing new business for that particular product line. And, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but you can see 10 months later, we have the banking crisis. And, that book, even though it looked bad in good times, would have looked absolutely appalling subsequent to the financial crisis. So it saved the business from significant losses. And the real takeaway for me on that is, delve into the data, delve into the detail. The overall position can look good, but inside it there can be nuggets that aren't so good. And you ultimately, in some of these, get to the point where you need to have those hard discussions. You need to make those bold decisions, and they're not the easy decisions to make.
How do you put the brakes on something like that? I mean, one imagine there's always politics within companies and what have you. You had people that understood and were helping champion shutting the book, or however you want to put it. But any other color you can share in terms of how the brakes were ultimately put on and whether there was much pushback?
I think you have to take people on the journey. I think you kind of start by, this is the early insight. Does it resonate with the business line owners, etc.? That's what they're seeing. That's what they think is happening. In that instance, they absolutely knew there was competitive pressures. That they knew in order to hit their volume targets, they were taking a bit more risk. And actually, it was over the analysis phase that it led to. What happened there was that I got the divisional chief executive on board, and then it was a case of taking it through the various the group stages. Once I got his buy-in, we went through the group stages, and ultimately, we reflected on it for a period of time. You're never going to get that decision instantly. It still took a number of months, but ultimately, what we first of all tried to do was make a tweak to see if it could be better. It didn't seem to move the needle, and then we ended up with the harder
Would
decision.
you say it was so building consensus and being patient, not so it everyone can get smart together? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you need time to reflect on, certainly when you're making bigger strategic decisions, and you need to build consensus, and you need to allow a period of time for that to ferment, people to look at it in detail, make their own decisions. I certainly don't think or advocate making snap decisions. I mean, occasionally you need to, but more often than not, you need to make it in a timely manner, but it doesn't need to be instant.
Hello and welcome to 60-second stories from CFO Thought Leader. Appointed CFO of MassMutual in 2015, Betsy Ward's CFO tenure has been punctuated by a string of strategic transactions, including the sale of MassMutual's retirement business to Empower in 2020, and the acquisition of Great American Life Insurance Company in 2019. Not to mention achieving the business combination of matching Oppenheimer funds within Invesco. You'll hear about those deals and much more on episode number 884 of CFO Thought Leader, featuring CFO Betsy Ward of MassMutual. Remember, the future of finance is listening.
Well, we want to jump to our mentoring round, where we ask you several quick questions intended to inform and inspire future finance leaders. We want you to think about the first time you were named a CFO and stepped into that role with all of its responsibilities, the first 30 to 60 days. If you could go back and give yourself a piece of advice, again, you got to remember who you were then, what you didn't know then, and what is the piece of advice you would give yourself?
So the piece of advice I would give myself is make sure you focus on managing upwards. And I mean, I think those moments when you're presenting in what I'd say is high risk stakes environments, even to this day, I still write down the key bullet points I want to get across. I don't rely on the slides to do it for me. And I think, it's about making sure that you know your agenda, what you're trying to get across, what you're trying to convey, because the danger otherwise is the talking and the slides are two different things. You need to give the message you want to, which will be on the slides, but you can't just talk to the slide. And I certainly can't do it just off the hoof. I can do it, but in those high risk stakes, when I'm looking for buy-in, influence and decisioning to be made, I think you need to I have to rehearse what I'm going to say and how I'm going to say it.
Okay. We always like to ask our guests to reflect a little bit on the personal side. We're wondering if you have a personal habit that you're known for, or part of a daily routine, something that over time people say that's just Paul's always done it that way, or this is what Paul does.
What I would say is people say I always look to be busy and engaged and doing things, and I'd like to say people think the door's always open. And I'll talk about most things that are going on, business or otherwise, with people. And therefore, it's that approachability. I mean, I reflect on it. This hybrid working has been great, but you do miss the personal side. I mean, in my mind, it reinforces the hierarchy, and you miss the interactions with the more junior members of the team that you're certainly not going to get through a Teams environment or a Zoom environment.
Is there a book you would recommend, something that may have influenced your thinking, or it might be something you escape with? Doesn't have to be anything.
there's no particular finance book I'd recommend to people. I always find that some of the stories and autobiographies of how business leaders or businesses have evolved are quite interesting. One I read not too long ago was Shoe Dog, which is the story of the Nike founder Phil Knight. We all know Nike today as this super powerful global sports and retail brand. You go back to the highs and lows of when Phil was setting up Nike, and you realize that actually nothing in business is plain sailing. Nothing is always, incremental, month on month, quarter on quarter. It's certainly choppy, and certainly in smaller entrepreneurial business, even to a degree, slightly more choppy. You look at, sometimes businesses like to portray that everything is smooth and everything goes in one direction and one direction only. Certainly underneath the surface, it's never quite that way.
I don't know if it's going to be based on Shoe Dog. I think part of it might be, but there's a movie coming out called Air about Air Jordans, the sneaker.
It's on Netflix. There's a Netflix. It's about, if you're talking about the same thing, I watched it actually. It's about the signing of Michael Jordan, and the deal is ultimately his mother negotiated, which was the first deal where he got a cut of the shoe sales.
Interestingly, it's supposed to be, I guess it's going to be on Amazon Prime here in the States. But the book is just outstanding in terms of what a wild ride it was at the early stages of Nike, just how that company just was on the edge so many times.
Nearly running out of cash at least 3 times in its early stages, and it's just a very interesting story.
Well, thank you. That's a nice selection for us, and we are up to our final question, where we're going to ask you to look forward as CFO of NewDay. What are your priorities over the next 12 months?
So I think certainly it's related to the external macro environment. Here in the UK, we've still got 10% inflation. It's come down very modestly. I know in the US, it's come down more steeply. You're more like at 5% as we sit here today. For us, that macro environment in terms of lending to consumers and how that transpires over the near term, and how the business navigates what is a foggy macro environment, and then how do we and when do we take action to position ourselves as that position hopefully improves, towards some point in the second half of this year, and therefore what is it we need to do, and how do we navigate that period?
Paul Sheriff, thank you for joining us on CFO Thought Leader.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hello, Thought Leader listeners. As you have perhaps already heard or even seen, we're now featuring the career lessons and moments of strategic insight shared by our CFO guests as Thought Leader videos. You can now find these videos on our blog at cfothoughtleader.com, and of course our newsletters, but also on LinkedIn. If you haven't already, please go ahead and follow our CFO Thought Leader LinkedIn company page, and you'll be certain not to miss a single Thought Leader video debut. CFO Thought Leader, the #1 thought leadership platform exclusively for and by CFOs. As always, thank you for listening.